You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Welcome back to Business of Drinks. I'm Scott Rosenbaum.
And I'm Erica Ducey. Today we're talking about the most quietly powerful non-alcoholic brand in the U.S. wine industry, which is FRE, F-R-E. And this is a 30-year-old NA wine brand from Trinchero Family Estates.
FRE was first launched back in 1992, decades before the non-alcoholic category was a category or anyone had ever heard the term sober curious. I remember when I started in retail in 2003, seeing it as the only bottle on the shelf that was a non-alcoholic wine. So, when it was created, it was really a bold move at the time. Trinchero had already reshaped the wine category once before when Robert Trinchero created Sutter Home White Zinfandel. And it was his brother Roger who really saw another opportunity on the horizon to give people kind of the full wine experience, just without the alcohol.
Yeah, and that insight led the family to invest millions of dollars in early spinning cone technology, which was the innovation that allowed them to remove alcohol while keeping the varietal flavor and aroma intact. And that focus on providing quality in a non-alc wine, it really helped FRE become the gateway brand for non-alcoholic wines in America. And now, decades later, it still holds nearly half of the entire U.S. NA wine category.
And that is no exaggeration. FRE, it holds 48% dollar share of the U.S. non-alcoholic wine market. That is 5 times larger than its next competitor. It sold around 439,000 cases last year, up nearly 16% in volume. What's even more impressive is that the brand continues to grow, adding more than 4,000 points of distribution and increasing velocity across key grocery and chain accounts.
Yeah, and what makes this conversation so interesting is how FRE is redefining what legacy brand innovation looks like in a changing world. So, Brie Wohld, Vice President of Marketing at Trinchero Family Estates, she shares in this episode how the team is modernizing FRE for a new generation. They've worked on design, digital storytelling, and partnerships that reach their target communities.
This conversation has some real great takeaways about revitalizing, re-energizing a legacy brand, how to drive double-digit growth with a 30-year-old category leader that is already at the top of its game. So if you're looking for insights on how to adapt, how to evolve a brand, or to lead with consumer insights, this episode is for you.
So let's get into it. Here's our interview with Brie Wohld of Trinchero Family Estates. And now, a word from our sponsor.
Listen, if you're launching or growing an alcohol brand, the first half of the year is when importers and distributors are making moves, which means right now is the time to get started in communicating with them.
Yeah, Swig Partners helps brands like yours grow faster and smarter and find the right distribution partners. The team has decades of relationships and is ready to help you succeed.
Right now, our listeners get an exclusive Q4 discount when you sign up before the end of 2025. Mention Business of Drinks and you'll get $300 off your service fee.
So start out the year strong by getting ahead of 2026 goals. Visit swigpartners.com/business of drinks. That's swigpartners.com/business of drinks. Brie, thanks so much for coming on the Business of Drinks.
Erica, thank you for having me. This is so fun.
So let's start with your background. Tell me how you came to lead marketing at Trinchero Family Estates.
Sure. For, I think, probably a lot of us in the drinks business, specifically in wine. The career sort of started with a family that loved wine. For my family, wine was always on the table at family gatherings. And as I became 21, it was a really fun thing to connect with my parents about and something we always enjoyed sharing with each other and talking about. So that foundation was sort of there from childhood. As I got into my 20s, I went to work for an agency. It was a subsidiary of Publicis Group in Seattle. And that branch of their office was all focused on culinary. It was a really cool office. So in the center of the office, they had a big culinary facility, culinary staff. We did recipe development and ingredient promotions and all kinds of cool stuff. This was probably 2005. So the Washington wine industry was also having a real resurgence at the moment and were becoming really recognized within the American wine culture. So it felt like a natural progression for an agency focused on food to pursue some wine business as well. So the agency was going to go court a new wine client, and I raised my hand and said, "Hey, I like wine. Can I be on the pitch team?" And they said yes. So we worked hard, long hours getting that together. It was such a fun project. And throughout that journey, I really fell in love with the messaging around wine and the people involved in wine. And it became a real passion project for me. The agency made it all the way to the last round. It was us and one other agency, and we didn't get the business. And I was heartbroken. And they said to us at the time that they loved all of the work and they loved all of the ideas, but we didn't have anybody on our staff with a traditional wine credential. So I raised my hand and said, "Hey, if you guys will pay for it, I'll go do the education." So they said, "Great." So I worked for the agency during the day. I went to classes at night for 2 years to get a wine credential. And then on the weekends, I went to work for a retailer called the Wine Outlet because the gentleman who owned it, a guy named Richard Kinsey's, was a respected wine journalist and educator. And he did these really cool classes that I couldn't afford. But if I worked for him on Saturdays, he let me come to his classes for free. So I was just gobbling up as much knowledge as I possibly could at that chapter in my life, and ultimately decided that to do more robust business management, it meant getting out of agency and into brand. And that path led me through an MBA at UCLA and into the Gallo system and did brand management there, which was an incredible experience. And then ultimately learned that for me, while fine wine is what I like to drink and what I like to talk about, commercial wine is really a passion point for me in terms of marketing. I think the marketing toolkit is really fun. The access to media and social media and the ability to be more playful is really interesting to me professionally. So coming to Trinchero was a natural progression for me based on the number of commercial brands and the scale and the reach here. So that was 11 years ago, and here we are today.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, I love to hear like the passion point of wine. I think there's, so many people working in this industry where you really choose it because you love it. And like I hear that come all the way through in your whole journey. So that's so cool. Let's talk a little bit about the background of Free. I want to know more about the brand's history and really its key attributes and values.
Absolutely. I think the history of free is really interesting, particularly today, because of where we are in terms of like cultural context in our country right now, and the parallels we can draw to where we were when the brand was first launched. So the brand was first introduced in the early 1990s. Roger Trinchero, who is second generation Trinchero family, he had an insight at the time that he could go to any restaurant really in the US and get a non-alc beer. But he said, "Why is it that I can't get a non-alc wine?" And I think the historical context is really interesting because what was happening in our country in the 1990s was somewhat of an anti-alcohol movement. And it was really driven by government messaging and public policy and an increased interest in health and wellness. And sounds familiar, right, to what we're going through right now in a lot of ways. And so that was where Roger had the foresight to say, "Hey, maybe there's an opportunity for us in wine. This isn't this place that only beer can play. Could we do it in wine?" So the thing that I think he really nailed at the time that has set us up for success since then was his commitment to quality. He believed that if it doesn't taste good, we're not going to get you to come back. I might get you to try the product once because there's a novelty component and it's kind of interesting, but we're never going to be where we want to be if we don't deliver quality. But to do that requires investment. It's a whole different set of production processes, which required some significant capital investment. At the time, the family went to Australia, where they could buy what was then cutting edge technology in this piece of spinning cone equipment, and spent well over $1 million, which relative to the size of the business was a pretty big investment. Brought the equipment to the US and really started learning how to do this process with respect to wine at its core. And that was really the early 1990s. And it was not an overnight success story. I think right now we feel like alcohol removed or non-alc category is this new exciting space, but it's been kind of doing its thing on the sidelines for a really long time. But that was the foundation. That was Roger's vision for what he thought we could do and the investments that he made. And it's really obviously paid off for us and created a pretty meaningful hedge, if you will, against some of the softness that we see in the wine category today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. And you have this background in commercial wines that I also share that passion. I think it's so fascinating, like when you can bring wine and wine portfolios to scale and reach that level of audience size. So I think you're, uniquely positioned to answer this question, which is about, the role that Free plays strategically within Trinchero's broader mix of brands. Like, how do you think about where it sits?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I'll answer that for Trinchero, but I'll answer it for the wine industry in general too, because I think that's important. For us, obviously Trinchero is a large organization. I think depending on the day of the week, there's somewhere between 50 and 60 brands that we're bringing to market in totality. But Free is one of our priority brands. It's a big piece of business for us just in terms of volume and in terms of revenue. But strategically, it really serves to, as I said earlier, it is a hedge against some of the softness that we've seen in traditional wine in recent years. So that really helps us from that perspective. But the thing that I think is really interesting from an industry perspective is the role that Non-Alc, led by Free, plays in sustaining wine as a part of culture. So if we have this movement that's happening and people are consuming less alcohol, consuming less wine, there's fewer reasons to go into the wine aisle unless you're looking for a non-alc product. So now we have a reason to bring people back into wine. We stay a part of their habits when they're shopping because they're still walking down the wine aisle, and we stay a part of the rituals of social gatherings. Right? If these offerings mean even if you're not drinking alcohol, you still think about the occasion of pouring a glass of wine, enjoying it with your friends, and whether you're choosing not to drink at all, or you're just choosing not to drink on certain occasions, or you're zebra striping. We all love that language now. It stays a part of the ritual of society. And I think that's such an important thing for our category. I will get the question every once in a while. Somebody will say to me, gosh, Trinchero is a winery. Why would you invest in perpetuating a message around sober October or dry January or pushing people out of alcohol beverage? And I would say it's quite the opposite. We're investing to keep people in by maintaining those rituals, maintaining those shopping habits, whether it's traditional alcohol, low alcohol, or no alcohol. You've got a glass of wine in your hand. And that is so important to all of us that I really see it as additive to the category.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that when you look at the consumer shopping behavior, like that really bears out, that whether it's zebra striping or just like certain occasions, like being able to maintain that ritual and occasion and keep that seat at the table, as it were, is incredibly important. Well, I was wondering, you have the benefit of working with 50 to 60 different brands. Are there lessons that you've learned from other brands that you worked with that have been useful in guiding the marketing strategy for Free?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at its core, the fundamentals of marketing strategy on Free are the same as any other consumer product, and that is consumer first, right? The critical importance of understanding your consumer. What do they care about? What challenges do they have in their life? What problems can you solve for them, or how do you add value to their life? Like that's the foundation of all of our brands, and I would argue for all of CPG. With wine specifically, I think how we're adding value to people's lives is through experience, whether that's a taste experience or a pairing experience or a socializing experience. Maybe in the world of fine wine, it's an intellectual experience that can be really rewarding for people. Maybe for others, it's just fun, and that's great too. But all of those things are part of how wine adds value to people's lives. And with Free, we use that same playbook. We're bringing those same types of experiences and just broadening the reach. Even if you don't want to consume alcohol, you can still have all of those types of experiences, and we can enrich your life in some of the same ways. So the foundation, the toolkit, if you will, is the same. And I think the other piece is the quality piece, right? We owe our consumers a quality experience. We know that from traditional wine. And it's no less true in non-alc wine, because that's how we earn their trust and those repeat purchases, of course.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you mentioned the size a little bit, and Free holds roughly half of the total US non-alc wine market, and it's about 5 times larger than the next competitor. So I was curious about what is it about either the marketing strategy or the channel strategy that's allowed Free to sustain that leadership position for, essentially 30 years?
Yeah. I think your question is about sustaining. And I would say to get there, it was about first mover advantage, right? That was obviously a big piece of the puzzle for us. But the really hard part is the sustaining part, as you asked in your question. I think there's really three pieces of that. It always is going to come back to quality. As I said, you can't keep people's trust if the quality is not there. Distribution and just physical availability. We have the advantage, of course, of operating within the Trinchero framework. So we have access to the distribution networks that were built around Sutter Home back in the 70s and 80s, and then have expanded with our company. So we have access to a lot of the market through our distribution network. And then from a marketing perspective, what I would say has been really important in sustaining that scale is adaptability. Is not saying, hey, the playbook of yesterday will always be the playbook of tomorrow. And I'll give you an example. One of our most popular marketing campaigns 15, 20 years ago was around designated driver programs. So the cultural context at the time was Mothers Against Drunk Driving was a pretty powerful voice. And so people were being really thoughtful about when they go out, how they drink, who's going to be the driver to get home. And we saw Free had an opportunity to insert itself in that conversation and provide solutions. So, hey, go out to the bar with your friends, have a glass of non-alc wine, and then help everybody get home responsibly. Right. So that was a culturally relevant message. It also was positioning us as a responsible player in AlcBev, which was great. But then things like Uber happened, and all of a sudden that message is not nearly as relevant, right? So you have to adapt. And not that designated drivers are not still very important, but it's just not to the same scale that it was, 20 years ago. But today we think about things like inclusive hosting. This is an idea that feels more culturally relevant. If you're bringing people to your home, have something for everybody. So now we're getting the messaging that I think resonates with the consumer today, but we're also getting the incremental purchase. So if you're going to buy a bottle of wine for a party, hey, don't forget your friends that don't drink, buy this too. So that's a win for us, and it's a win for our retail partners. So we're kind of bringing everybody along.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Free has one of the most complete portfolios in non-alc wine. There's sparkling, there's red, there's white, there's minis in 187 mLs. And so how is it that you think about the portfolio architecture and ensuring that each SKU serves a clear consumer occasion?
Yeah, I think for me, what that comes down to is something that's a core value for me in everything that we do with our brands, and that's about respect for the consumer. And what I mean by that is, if we think that the consumer of traditional alcohol would find value in a Chardonnay for some occasions, and a Sauvignon Blanc for some occasions, and a sparkling for some occasions, why would we choose to believe that the consumer of non-alc only needs one red and one white? Right? What if I think discovery and choice is just as important for the consumer choosing a non-alc wine as it is for a traditional wine. So we want to bring those choices. I think when I think about portfolio strategy, I do think there's an important piece of balance. So it's having enough choice that you are giving people options, that you're bringing discovery, that you're bringing a little bit of fun to that shopping experience and that drinking experience, but not so many choices that it's totally overwhelming. If you give people 3,000 choices while they're shopping, don't know what the number is, but there's been studies that show it's a bell curve, right? I like the choice, I like choice, I like choice. Way too much choice, I'm out. And so I think for us, we've really been thoughtful about how many offerings we bring to the portfolio, so that we do offer the right amount of choice, but we don't overwhelm people at the same time.
Yeah, and I recently saw the Pinot Grigio was added to the lineup. So I think that brings the lineup to around 10 750 ml SKUs. And I wondered, was there a particular consumer insight or market signal that told you that it was the right time to add Pinot Grigio?
Yeah, I think the innovation strategy or process here works very similar to other traditional wine brands, in that we watch marketplace trends, we see what's resonating in market, we see where the consumers are shifting their shopping behaviors. And certainly, we've all seen that light aromatic white wines seem to be performing really well, whether that's Sauvignon Blanc or Pinot Grigio. That seems to be what consumers, largely younger consumers in particular, seem to be gravitating to. We think for a lot of those consumers, there's a lot of options with RTD and being sessionable seems to be important, and refreshing seems to be important. And Pinot Grigio plays a nice role in that. So it filled a little gap for us between what was Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc, giving us one more option in light, refreshing white wines in a space that consumers seem to be really engaged with. And we're always interested in attracting those younger consumers in. And we saw that Pinot Grigio was probably going to be a good way for us to do that.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned the innovation pipeline. How is it that a new free wine comes to life? Like, what does that look like, from identifying a consumer need to, sensory quality testing? Like, what does the whole inception to launch process look like?
Yeah, I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record, but it's also very much like our commercial wine process, and that's by design. So it starts with that data-driven insight. What are the trends in the marketplace? And you line those up against what do you have in your portfolio, and you see where those gaps are. And then the next step is the vineyard. It really does start in the vineyard with us. Our vineyard team and winemaking team are very selective about choosing the grape sources that they think will have the most success in a non-alc product formulation. So they'll go source the grapes that make the most sense for us. For example, lower sugar grapes tend to have lower alcohol naturally. So it requires less manipulation on the back end. So we'll choose those grapes. And then the winemaking team gets to work and does their magic. They'll prepare a few different blends for us all to sit down and try. And it's a great collaboration between vineyard and winemaking and marketing and operations to decide which one of these blends is most likely to deliver on a consumer expectation for that varietal. Being as true to the varietal as we can be has always been one of the core values with the FRE brand. So we work hard to deliver all of that. And we think we've selected the wine that best meets the consumer expectation. And then we go over to the creative team and ask them to help us develop a message and a look and a feel that will resonate with the consumer we think is interested in that varietal. And off we go.
Yeah, yeah. And just in general for free wines, we talked a little bit about the spinning cone technology, but what does the overall production process look like? And is it consistent? So like you just mentioned, maybe a lower alc wine, you want that. So you might be picking earlier or some sort of vineyard decisions like that.
Yeah, vineyard decisions are a key component of that, and that will vary depending on which varietal it is that we're making. But the really interesting part of the process that makes it unique, of course, is the dealcoholization process. So our winemaking team will go through traditional vinification. The grapes come in, we crush, we press, we ferment. All of those things happen in exactly the same way as they would with a traditional wine. But then the special step comes in through the dealcoholization. So the equipment that we use is called a spinning cone, and it really uses centrifugal force. It spins the wine and it removes the flavors and the aroma molecules from the liquid. We hold those off to the side. Then we go through the process again to remove the alcohol molecules from the liquid. Then we take those flavors and aromas, we reintroduce them back to the liquid to give that authentic experience back to the wine. So it's really a fascinating process and one of the key differentiators, I think, for our brand. Many of the products that you see on shelf today will be grape juice or grape must, that are packaged in 750 glass, and they have their role to play as well. For us, the traditional winemaking process and dealcoholization, making it an alcohol removed product, was really important in delivering as much authenticity as we can to the final taste experience.
Nice. Looking a little bit at the brand experience, I've noticed that Free has updated its brand imagery. It has like a more sort of bold, colorful look. And then at the same time, it seems that the brand is leaning into more experiential programming like music festivals, women's events, things like that. So I was wondering, how intentional has that evolution been? And what prompted the timing for a change for the brand?
Yeah, absolutely intentional, and I'm glad that you can see it from where you sit, because we're pretty proud of the work that's happened to help the brand evolve. One of the things I said earlier was that adaptability was one of the core tenets that I think has enabled our success, and adaptability in our visual identity is certainly a component of that. So for us, our consumer base is really broad. We have a large cohort of baby boomer consumers or people who were traditional wine consumers and for whatever age related reasons are able to consume wine, but it's such a part of their life and their ritual. So they love Free. They've loved Free for a long time. They're very loyal to Free. And we love those folks very much. And we always want to continue to give them what they value about us. And I think the number one most important there is quality and consistency. So that will never change. But for us, because of this moderation movement that we're seeing in culture and society, there is such a tremendous opportunity to introduce the brand to new generations. But the old playbook won't work. So we built a new playbook. And we're having a lot of success with that. It's a millennial target and a Gen Z target. And we can certainly talk about some of the nuances in those audiences because they're different. But a lot of what we're doing now is trying to make sure our brand stays culturally relevant with a new generation of consumers and a generation of consumers who is very visual, right? In the Instagram era, everything we buy, everything we wear, everything we consume is part of the personal brand that we project to the world. And so if we want to be a part of those people's lives, we have to deliver to them an aesthetic that helps support the lifestyle that they want. And so that's really been some of the inspiration around the evolution that you've seen.
Yeah, well, let's dig into the actuality of it as well. So, what are some of those key creative and cultural shifts behind the brand update? Visually, tonally, in the messaging. What does that look like?
Yeah, it's really fun. One of the things I think we're trying to do is to work hard at the idea of community. How do we insert the brand into communities that already exist and become a part of their lives? Add value in that way. Some of the communities that we've seen that have really embraced us, there's an organization called Create and Cultivate. It's this incredible organization that's really based in largely female entrepreneurs and founders and supporting their careers and their businesses and their lives. And for a lot of those women, as you can imagine, they're very busy and they got a lot to do and they want to socialize. And networking is an incredibly important part of how they build their businesses and their brands, but they also have to optimize their own productivity all the time. So it's a perfect environment for a non-alc wine to participate because we can support their lifestyle and their objectives and value what they value and play a role in that. So that's been a really cool space for us to participate in. There's also been other organizations, a really cool organization called Camp Social, which is like adult sleepaway camp. And again, while it's certainly not anti-alcohol and alcohol has a presence there too, there is a component of wellness and those sorts of things that the group participates in and values. So they really love choice. It's not about not this or that. It's really about options. You can come, you can socialize, you can make new friends, and you can choose to drink alcohol or not, and we'll give you choices. So those are the types of communities where we've really found some resonance for the brand, and it's a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. Well, were there challenges along the way? You're thinking about modernizing a legacy brand for a new generation, but you have those like baby boomers, the sort of core loyal audience. Was any part of that challenging, or, how did that factor into the decision making about the new look and feel?
It's the classic the growth dilemma for a legacy brand, right? We will all say the same things. How do we hold on to our core audience while reach new audiences? We don't want to alienate, but we got to be culturally relevant. How do you do both? I think the good news is that consumers will give you permission to adapt, especially if you are committed to quality, if you're committed to consistency, and you don't stretch beyond your core values. I think there are ways to hold your values consistent, but the way you express them can evolve. And consumers are willing to allow that. So I think for our older consumers, as we continue to deliver consistency and quality, they trust us. Anything that we do, we can always be a little more playful when it comes to consumer activations and social media activations and push the envelope a little further in those channels. When it comes to things like in-store activations and certainly packaging, we'll be very thoughtful and strategic about how far we evolve, but we'll take step changes. We're going through a process right now to evaluate our packaging. We think there's an opportunity to continue to evolve, but we'll do it in a way that makes sure we don't alienate the core consumer, but we bring the younger consumer in at the same time. I read something interesting the other day about how younger consumers, let's call it 20 somethings, are the CMOs of their family because they're the ones that identify what's cool, what's interesting, and then their parents and sometimes even their grandparents learn from them. So in a lot of ways, I think we are protected from alienating our older consumer by being really cool to their kids. And their kids will say, don't worry, it's still cool. And then everybody can enjoy it together.
I love that, the multi-generational. Well, let's talk a bit about data. What does the data show that Trinchero has access to about how consumers are actually drinking alcohol-removed wines? Are there certain occasions that over index or, food pairings or I don't know, social context? Like what type of information do you find that seems particularly notable?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is we talk a lot about the social occasion, and that's incredibly important. From the data that we've collected through our own research, we see that it's like something like a third of usage occasions that consumers will tell us is actually those social moments. So it's still important. But that at home relaxing occasion is still really, really important for the consumer who wants that ritual of a glass of wine with their dinner or as they're winding down with the spouse. That's still a big piece of the opportunity for us. The on premise occasion growing, but I think there's still so much opportunity there. And certainly the way we get to that insight is through the sales data around the on premise channel. We're seeing that occasion continue to grow. There's a way in there related to wine cocktails and using de-alc wine as an ingredient in wine cocktails that I think is really fun. But I also think there's a place for de-alc wine by the glass. I think that's really important. One of my favorite stats when we talk about the data about this industry and what's going on, that Nielsen tells us is that 93% of shoppers who buy a non-alc wine product also buy traditional alcohol. So that really helps us feel confident in this idea that we are not pushing people out of the category, but we are bringing people into the category. And these people are buying alcohol too. So it is truly incremental. And I think that gives us a lot of confidence in the role that we're playing in the larger wine industry.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned, there's some boomers, there's some millennials, there's some Gen Z, there must be Gen X in there. When you're conceptualizing the target audience for free, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think for baby boomers, we know the role that it plays, and it is largely as a substitute for wine because they can't consume in the same way that they used to. So we're pretty clear on what that looks like. For Gen X and for millennials, it's also generally what we hear from them is that it is a substitute, but more occasion driven. So I'm trying to drink alcohol fewer days of the week, or the zebra striping idea. I'm going to have a glass of wine at dinner. I still want something in my hand, so now I'll have a non-alc. Maybe I'll have another or not, but it's a substitution for a traditional alcohol, whether that's completely or by occasion or whatever that is. And then with Gen Z, it's interesting because for some of those consumers, wine may not be a part of their life yet, so they're not replacing traditional wine with non-alc wine, but they're experimenting with lots of different types of non-alc products, and non-alc wine can be a component of that. So what's really interesting is I think in that scenario, non-alc is an on-ramp to wine, right? So maybe you're experimenting with the non-alc mocktails and you're experimenting with other types of RTDs and non-alc wine. And then eventually you decide you want to have a traditional glass of wine. So you come that way. So it's like, it can kind of go either ways. It's substituting out, or we're actually introducing you right back in.
Right, exactly. Because with the cocktails, maybe then you become familiar with the taste of wine and then you're onboarding to other wine products, which makes a lot of sense. And I also wondered about wellness cues. So freeze wines, they contain fewer calories than typical wines. They're vegan, they're gluten free. How much would you say those wellness cues play in discovery of the brand?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that has evolved. 10 years ago, when we were looking at communication hierarchy on the brand, things like fewer calories, being vegan, being gluten-free really didn't make the list. It wasn't something that we thought was really important to that consumer. It was almost entirely just about replacing your wine occasion. But that has really shifted over time. And I think it was maybe 7 years ago, we started testing the lower calorie message. Digitally, we could do some A/B testing and sort of gauge consumer interest. And we were really encouraged to hear that consumers really cared about that message, because for some people, choosing not to drink was simply a dietary choice. I'm trying to limit my calories, and now I can have this other option. So then it became a more important message for us, the calorie component. And now, because wellness considerations have become a bigger driver into the category, things like being gluten free and being vegan, all of those things are becoming increasingly more important. And we hear our consumers ask us about that. We go out to some of these events and we talk about the product, and they really want to understand all of the attributes about the product. I think people are really thoughtful about what they consume and what they put in their bodies. And so they ask you a lot more questions as a winemaker than maybe they did 10 years ago. So that's been fun to see. And it gives us just even more conversation tools to have with folks when we get out into the market.
Yeah, and let's talk about pricing. I generally see free on the shelf for around the $10 price point. So I think that's, hitting an accessible price point, yet it conveys a certain quality level. So how intentional is that pricing in really framing the category? Like, how do you think about that pricing structure?
Yeah, it is very intentional. I mean, we obviously our goal here is scale. We want this to be a large scale brand. We want the price point to be accessible, but we also don't want to signal that we're trading down in quality or that the product is in any way less than. And interestingly, if you think about it, there's actually more investment in the process because it has to go through a whole additional step. So it's more expensive to make in some ways because we have an additional production step to make and to go through. So that I think that pricing is really an important way that we maintain accessibility, but we don't undervalue ourselves so that the consumer feels confident in what they're getting.
Yeah, yeah. We talked a little bit about the experiential and community driven activations that Free does. Walk me through the other pillars or sort of the program for the marketing strategy for the brand.
Yeah. So we talked about the consumer activation piece, which has been really fun. And social media remains a really important part of the brand strategy. Of course, it's a great way for us to reach new consumers. One of the things that we've done recently that we have had a lot of fun with is what's called a sober city guide. So we go into major metropolitan markets all over the US and develop an online toolkit, if you will. So if you're visiting the city and you want to go to sober bars or do activities that maybe are more aligned with that lifestyle, we present that to you to create some value for our consumers there. It all really ties back to the things I keep saying around how do we add value to their lives. We really work hard at considering how are we going to help add value to these people's lives. So whether it's the events that we show up at or the content that we deliver to them in social media, certainly in store will always be really important to us, and we'll continue to invest in driving velocity at retail, supporting our customers and their success. Programs like Dry January and Sober October are still really important pillars. The consumer wants to be there and they're doing those sort of challenges already. So we'll be there for them and we'll participate in that conversation so that we're a part of what's going on in their lives. And I think those are some of the key components of how we're getting our message integrated into what consumers already want to talk about.
Yeah. And, talking a little bit about the consumer activations and partnerships that you've done, are there any, fresh insights that you've uncovered in those partnerships that led to changes in how you think about your target consumer or any insights you can share that it sort of was an aha moment for you?
Yeah, I think it's always so fun. We as business people, we sit in our conference rooms and we read our data and our reports and we do our custom research and we have all our facts and figures. And then you go out into the real world and there's always, sort of a reconciliation of what you think is true and what you hear from people. So it's always really fun to hear what people have to say and to share with us when we're out with those groups. I think one of the most powerful messages that we've heard is really that idea of how our product helps align with a lifestyle that is oriented around productivity and being busy. For so many of these women that we talk to, they're working, they're moms, they want these occasions, they want to celebrate, they want to have fun, they want to be social. So it's not about less than, it's about helping them have more than. And a lot of these people choose to drink at different times, but they love the role that Free plays in supporting their overall life strategy. And that's one of the things I think that we hear really loud and clear when we get out and talk to people.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because I think it's like, we talk a lot about affordable luxuries on this show or, like little rituals, which
Yeah.
definitely seems to be, have, a concept that's taken off among Gen Z, especially. But I think, everyone at any life stage at this point, I think in consumer culture, we have been accustomed and ingrained in like these little rituals, these like affordable luxuries, like little ways that you can treat yourself in a way that feels, in this case, like it won't derail your next day, which I definitely appreciate. And along those lines, I wondered because you have such a big consumer audience that you're looking to target, do you have to kind of segment out and differentiate how you're messaging to those audiences? So, like, let's say we have a sober, curious consumer who is unfamiliar with the brand versus, a longtime consumer. Like, how is it that you think about, breaking out the messaging for different audiences, or do you do that at all?
It might be a little bit less than you think because I think the one truth that we want to hold true across every segment of our follower base is around choice. So we never want to say, do this, don't do that. This behavior is good, this behavior is bad. We really want to make sure that it's always positive, it's always inclusive, and we're always giving people choice. So whether, you are choosing a sober lifestyle or you're not choosing a sober lifestyle, we would never use language like, hey, drink non-alc instead. It's just like, hey, here's a choice for you. Here's an
Yeah.
option for you. So that we're being inclusive. At the end of the day, we're a winery, right? We care about the health of traditional alcohol wine very much. So we want to make sure that the role we're playing in the industry is responsible and supports the industry in general, while also giving consumers a really positive message around the choices they make and being inclusive.
Yeah, I love that message of choice. You mentioned the sober city guides. I think that's a really interesting way to say, like, okay, here is an inclusive way to experience a city if you happen to not be drinking at this moment for any time. But I wondered, like, across social channels that you're on right now as the brand, what are some of the either campaigns or sort of marketing messages that are working best for the brand right now?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It varies by channel. So we are very active on social media in Facebook and in Instagram and in TikTok. Because of the legalities of TikTok, we were able to get on the platform a little earlier than some of the other alcohol bev brands, which just gave us a little more time to experiment and to play on that channel. And it's been hugely successful. We've already built an equal following in TikTok that we have in Instagram and Facebook in a much shorter amount of time. And the content that resonates, I think there is really, it is around lifestyle. Consumers always have fun, even like food and wine pairings. Some of the fundamentals with wine that work also work in social media. They want to talk about food and wine pairings. They love mocktail recipe ideas. So I think it's just, again, it comes back to that idea for me of adding value to them. A picture of here's my bottle shot, aren't I great, isn't adding value. But let me give you a recipe. Let me give you a city guide. Let me give you a DIY craft idea, whatever that is that gives them something. Now, all of a sudden, we're playing a different role in their life instead of just using as an advertising platform to talk about ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. And how is it that you think about brand health? So we have traditional sales metrics, but on the marketing side, like, how is it that you are measuring, is this brand healthy right now? How do you think about that?
Yeah, obviously those sales metrics, sales growth, repeat purchase, sales velocity, all of those things are very, very important to us. And that's how we continue to build our distribution and sustain the distribution that we have. But engagement in social media is really important. Sentiment in social media is really important. How people talk about us. So are they proud to share the brand with their friends? Are they not just liking our content, but sharing it out to their own networks? Those are some of the more nuanced metrics that we take a look at, because I think it shows not just are they buying us, but do they love us? How are they interested in sharing, and what are they doing in that space? So has it gone beyond a functional benefit that we provide to them to an emotional benefit that makes it want to share with their friends and become a part of their own personal brand? Those are the things that I think are really important metrics to look at as well.
Yeah. And so speaking of size, FRE sold around 439,000 cases last year per Shankin, growing about almost 16% in volume. And it continues to show strong growth this year, really outperforming greater category trends. So, what would you say has been most effective in terms of sustaining that level of growth in the double digits at scale?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. It's expanded distribution. We've added more than 4,000 points of distribution in the last year. And we're sitting in more than 28,000 accounts sold nationwide. So that physical availability and the growth of that account base is critically important. But then the other piece is the increased velocity where we have it. So we're seeing more consumer demand, product is turning faster. So both of those things together support a lot of the trajectory, but there's still so much untapped potential. I think about our opportunity in the on-premise is huge because of the organization that Free lives in, Trinchero. We're using our traditional alcohol distributors to get into all the same places where alcohol exists, but there's so much more, right? Food brokers are becoming a part of the equation, or have been a part of the equation for us for a while. They fill some of the white space where traditional alc bev distributors either can't service or it's not a part of their business model. And there's more untapped potential there. So I think there's so much opportunity for non-alc products to get into lots of different types of places. Can we be where people buy clothes? Can we be where people shop for art? Things that don't have a traditional alcohol license. And in some states that's legal, in some states it's not. And We would keep our lawyers very busy trying to figure those things out for us. But that will be a part of the growth strategy ongoing.
Nice. And I'm sure that landscape is changing quickly. Well, what type of retail outlets do you think perform best right now for the brand?
It's almost the same as commercial wine for us. So our primary channels are grocery and liquor and mass. Our main volume accounts are massive chains like Kroger and Target and Publix. All those sorts of places where you find commercial wine is where you find non-alc wine. So I think it's a pretty similar route to market model.
Nice, nice. Well, starting to wrap up a little, looking at consumer behavior more broadly, how are you seeing moderation and mindful drinking trends evolve from where you sit?
I think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier with the idea that it doesn't have to be rigid. It doesn't have to be, I'm a person who drinks or I'm a person who does not drink. It can be occasion based. It can be maybe I don't drink on Tuesdays, but I still enjoy traditional wine on Saturdays. Maybe it's a zebra striping thing again as a part of a moderation strategy for consumers. And I think people are considering what moderation looks like in different ways. It doesn't have to be a this or a that or a black and a white definition for people, which I think is really interesting. And as Gen Z continues to age, and they maybe didn't have some of the same alc bev rituals that we had, and certainly COVID played a role in changing the way their coming of age journey went. I think they will continue to redefine what that means, and whether it will be a substitute for a wine experience or a way into wine, like we talked about before. I think the millennial and the Gen X generation will function a little bit more like previous generations, but Gen Z is going to change that landscape and that conversation, and teach all of us how to think more broadly and be more flexible in how we build our rituals around alc bev.
Yeah, it certainly seems like that's the way things are headed. Well, two-part question here. So, what are your thoughts on where the non-alcoholic wine category is headed? And what role should a market leader like FRE play in shaping that culture?
I think, like any growing category, there will be proliferation of options, right? We're all, especially when the larger wine category is challenged, every supplier, every winery is looking for growth opportunities. Where are the green shoots in the category? So what I expect is that we'll continue to see more of what we have seen, which is new entrants entering space, whether it is in varietal de-alc wine or grapes that look like wine or mocktails and that kind of a space. I think there'll be a lot of choice for the consumer that will be really fun to a point, and then probably will get a little oversaturated, and the consumer will tell us who wins and who loses. I think the wine brands that focus on quality and consistency are more likely to stand the test of time, but there will be an interesting evolution of what that shelf set looks like. It's really cool to see the way, it wasn't that long ago that non-alc wine sort of lived in a dusty corner of the liquor store or the grocery store, and you had to know what you were looking for to find it. There wasn't really a discovery opportunity because it was tucked back in a corner. And that's really changed. We see so many retailers who now have a full non-alc set. I think the ones that are really getting it right are the ones that are merchandising non-alc beer with non-alc wine and mocktails. So creating a real destination for the shopper to have choice and discovery. I think we're creating incrementality in the purchase because you are intrigued by what you find. I think that will happen more and more and more. I think those shelf set will get bigger. They'll probably get too big at some point, and then the consumer will tell us who delivered for me on quality, who do I trust?
And, if you had to give one piece of advice to a drinks brand founder about building the brand that has staying power, given that you have worked with so many drinks brands and wine brands at this point, what would that advice be?
Yeah, I think my advice there would be we are in the middle of a generational transition right now. So the playbook that the leaders of the past used will not be the playbook that gets us to success in the future. So be bold and be creative. Don't lean on the past when you're navigating the futures for yourself. The other thing I think is you asked for one, but I'm going to give you two. I say be obsessed with your consumer. Be crystal clear on the value that you are adding to their life, and understand not what you think you bring to them, but what they tell you bring to them. But at the same time, don't underestimate the importance of the ecosystem that we operate in. Because of the way the alcohol beverage industry is structured, in our country, it is critically important that we understand not only how we add value to the consumer, but how are we adding value to our retail partners, our on-premise partners, because you don't get a chance in front of the consumer until you get a chance with them, and their success will be your success. So being mindful of the entire ecosystem, I think, is a really important part of how we bring these brands to market, and then how we develop that staying power.
Yeah, sage advice for sure. And then our last question, we always like to ask people for a source of inspiration. So, let's say that a drinks entrepreneur asks you for, it could be a book, an online course, a person to follow, something or someone to give them insights on their journey. Who or what would you recommend?
Well, I would start with the business of drinks, and I would say go
Thank
listen
you.
to that podcast. I think the work that you guys are doing is so powerful for the industry, and you're providing such an interesting behind the scenes look into how the industry really works, not just what we see on the shelf. If I was starting my own business and I wanted to learn how it all really works, this would be an incredible place to start. In addition to that, I am an avid reader and a lover of books. So we actually have our little book club here in our marketing department that we use as a way to build our collective knowledge, to get inspiration, to drive conversations, and make sure that we're all getting smarter and more creative all the time. And I think the last two books that we read, I'll give you both because they're a really nice complement to each other. How Brands Grow by Byron Sharp is like a classic marketing book that I think does a really good job of walking through the academics and the more data-driven components of what it means to build a brand and to develop an effective marketing strategy. But then you complement that part with a book called Emotion by Design, written by the former CMO of Nike, which is all about the human component. It's emotional intelligence, and it's tapping into what we value as humans. And when you layer those two things together, I think you get a really nice set of information that can help anybody think creatively about building a brand and successfully getting it to market.
Yeah, that sounds like a nice pairing for sure. Speaking of pairings. So I think that is a great place for us to conclude. Brie, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I think a lot of founders and people in the drinks industry are going to take a lot away from what you've shared with us today. So thank you so much for coming on the Business of Drinks.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us on Business of Drinks. Subscribe on YouTube at Business of Drinks Podcast. Follow us on Spotify or listen in on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. Please tap the notification button so you'll be the first to know when a new episode drops.
And help us spread the word. Click those star ratings, give us a review, and share episodes or clips on your socials. It really helps us reach new listeners.
Finally, if there's something that you'd like us to cover on the podcast, tell us. We're at podcast@businessofdrinks.com or reach out via Instagram or LinkedIn.
We love hearing from you, and we respond to each and every message. Thanks, and see you next time.